Hi, welcome to my presentation on the language of anatomy, and we will also go over kind of a brief introduction to anatomy and physiology. So we'll start with the levels of biological organization that are relevant in anatomy and physiology. So first you have the chemical level, which is kind of the smallest level of organization that organisms will have. At the chemical level, you have, of course, chemicals. So that includes individual atoms and also atoms that are bonded together to form molecules. Some of the molecules in organisms are really small, but some of them are very big. The ones that are really big, we call them macromolecules. And you probably remember the four different types: proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and lipids. Those macromolecules will have thousands of different atoms in them. A lot of them are polymers, which means that it's like a chain of different subunits that are all kind of linked together to make the chain. A couple of the ones that are polymers would be the proteins and the nucleic acids, which are the DNA and RNA. That chemical level of organization ends up being really important for us, even though it's so small. And that's because depending on what atoms you have making up a macromolecule, that is going to determine its chemistry, its chemical properties, and that will determine its function. Another thing that can determine the function of a macromolecule is its shape at a chemical level. And the function of your macromolecules is kind of determining your function, or the function of your cells, and then you as a whole organism. So particularly for DNA and for proteins, the shape is really important, not just the chemistry, although the chemistry is important as well. So for DNA, it's both the chemistry and the shape of it that is allowing it to store information and allowing that information to be copied when cells divide. For proteins, the chemistry and the shape of the protein kind of work together to determine the function of the protein. And proteins are kind of doing most of the work in your cells. So what proteins you have and how they're functioning in your cells is determining what your cells are doing or how your cells function, and then that determines how you function. Above the chemical level, you have the cellular level of organization. Of course, you probably remember that cells are the basic unit of life. So, of course, everybody's body, or all organisms, have their body made up out of cells. Some organisms that are really simple just have one cell, like bacteria, but organisms like us have a lot of different cells. And we call them multicellular organisms. So in multicellular organisms, the cells are going to be specialized. So they're not all the same type of cell. They're actually different from each other, and they have different functions, and they're all kind of working together, doing different functions to keep the organism alive. Even though the different cells in your body have different functions, they all have the same DNA. So they all have the same information inside of them that they can use to make proteins. So the way that you can have the same DNA in all your cells and yet have different types of cells is because not all of your cells are using all of the genes. So if you're comparing kind of a cell in your brain to a cell in your bone, those are going to have different shapes and very different functions. They're going to have the same DNA inside of them, but they're not going to be using the same genes. So the brain cell, maybe it's a neuron, would be using genes that are for neurons, and the bone cell would be using maybe genes that are for osteocytes, which is a common type of bone cell. Those genes will each make a protein, so when you're using those genes, that means you're expressing the gene to make some type of protein, and those are going to be different proteins or a different set of proteins that are ultimately expressed in the neuron versus in the bone cell or the osteocyte. And then those different proteins have different functions, which will convey different functions to the cells. So gene expression is just when you're using a gene to make a protein. Because you're expressing different genes in different types of cells, that gives you the different cell types. Above the cellular level, you have the tissue level of organization. A tissue is a number of cells that are, kind of physically next to each other. Also, they're extracellular matrix that are all working together to serve a common purpose. So the extracellular matrix is kind of like a network of different molecules outside of the cells that kind of connect them to each other. the extracellular matrix is actually made by the cells in the tissue. So different types of cells will make different molecules to go into the extracellular matrix. So depending on what types of cells you have in the tissue, that's going to determine what the extracellular matrix looks like. Actually, in the next chapter, we'll go over different molecules that you can find in the extracellular matrix and what their functions are. So together, all the different types of cells that you have in this tissue and their extracellular matrix that they have secreted are going to be sharing a common purpose or a common function. So you might have different types of cells there, but they're all going to be kind of working together to serve some function. The extracellular matrix will be contributing to that function as well in different ways depending on what molecules you have inside of it. But some things that the extracellular matrix will commonly do in all different types of tissues is to just kind of hold the cells together in the tissue and give it structural organization and structural support, and also to kind of carry signaling molecules between the cells so that the cells can be talking to each other. So of course you're going to have different types of tissue throughout your body, depending on what cells you have in different locations and what extracellular matrix those cells have made. That's going to determine the different tissue types that you have. And in all cases, the characteristics of the tissue is going to serve the function of the tissue. So in your bone, you have a mineralized extracellular matrix. So, that gives a really hard tissue for your bones. In the brain, the extracellular matrix is really soft and the tissue ends up being really soft, but that's really good for signaling. So different tissues will have their physical characteristics match with their function. Above the tissue level of organization, you have the organ level. Every organ has to have at least 2 types of tissue within it, but it might have more. So if you have a structure in your body that is composed of at least 2 types of tissue, that's an organ. Assuming that those tissues are kind of working together to serve a function or to carry out a task. So in anatomy and physiology, we're going to kind of look at the different tissues and the different organs in the body. The shape of each organ, which is its anatomy, is suited to its purpose so that it can, serve its function. And the characteristics of its tissues and the cells within those tissues will also allow the organ to perform its function. And then the functioning of that organ is its physiology. So anatomy is always for form or for shape, and physiology is always about function or how something is operating. Some of your organs are really small. Some of them are so big or kind of distributed around the body that you might not even think of them as being organs. So an example of that would be your skin, which you probably might not think of as an organ, but it actually has 2 different types of tissue in it that are both working together to serve the task of protecting the body from the outside environment, so that makes it an organ. The vasculature, which is all the blood vessels in your body, is also counting as an organ because it has multiple tissue types and it's working to serve a specific purpose, which is to transport things around the body. Above the organ level, you have the organ system level. So anytime you have 2 or more organs that are kind of sharing a similar function or working together to carry out an overall task, that's an organ system. So a good example of that is the digestive system, where you have the esophagus as one organ in that system, which is carrying food from the mouth down to the stomach. Then in the stomach, which is another organ, you have the food kind of being sterilized using acid, and you're starting to digest the food as well. Then in the intestines, in the small intestine, you're kind of finishing digesting that food and absorbing the molecules from the food or absorbing the nutrients into your body. And then in the large intestine, you're continuing to absorb certain nutrients, but also a lot of water, and just kind of converting whatever's left of the food into a waste product that you're going to excrete as feces. So all these different organs in the digestive system have their own specific function or a specific set of functions, but they have to all work together for you to actually ingest and get nutrients out of your food. If you're missing any one of those organs, you're not going to be able to effectively eat and digest your food and get nutrients out of it. So each organ in that organ system is playing one small role in the overall task of ingesting and digesting food. And finally, I'll mention that some organs are actually classified into multiple organ systems. An example of that is the pancreas. The pancreas is actually considered part of the digestive system because it releases enzymes into the small intestine that are necessary for you to digest your food and break it down. But the pancreas is also part of the endocrine system because it releases hormones into the blood, like insulin is one of the major hormones that the pancreas releases. And then, of course, the final level of biological organization that's relevant in A&P is just the whole organism. So if you take all the organ systems in an organism, and kind of put them together, you get an organism. And actually, in other disciplines of biology, you can keep going with the levels of biological organization. So if you take an ecology class, you'll find out about larger levels of organization, but that's all we need for anatomy and physiology. So here's kind of a figure summarizing the levels of biological organization. So we start with the chemical level. The different molecules in your body, which are, in general organized into cells. Different types of cells have different functions and different molecules inside of them. Then those cells are going to be organized together into a tissue along with the extracellular matrix that they have secreted. So all the cells in the tissue and their extracellular matrix will all be working together to serve one specific function. Then if you have two or more tissues that also are kind of coordinating with each other to serve a function, that gives you an organ. Then if you have multiple organs that are coordinating with each other to serve a really general function, that gives you an organ system. And then all the organ systems in the body counts as an organism or forms an organism. So throughout A&P1 and A&P2, if you take both of them, we're going to learn about all the different organ systems in the human body, which are 11 different organ systems. So we'll just kind of go through a brief overview of them right now. You have the integumentary system, which is your skin, the skeletal system, muscular system, nervous system, endocrine system, cardiovascular system, lymphatic system, respiratory system, digestive system, urinary system, and reproductive system. So starting with the integumentary system, that is your skin. Its basic function is to protect the body from the external environment. It's called the integumentary system because the word integument actually is just a covering or a coating, so the skin coats your body. It has other functions as well in addition to protecting the body. It also makes vitamin D if you're exposed to sunlight. It helps keep water inside the body, which is really important because you have a lot of water inside your body and you need it, you need it. And it also plays a large role in regulating your body temperature. All of the sensors for body temperature are located in the skin, and depending on if you're sweating or how much blood flow there's going through the skin, that's going to determine whether you're kind of conserving heat or whether you're losing heat to cool down. Then you have the skeletal system, which is the bones in your body, but it also includes the joints as well. So of course the bones are involved in providing structural support for the body and also protection for some of your internal organs, but it's also involved in moving. Both the joints and the bones themselves are important for movement, so the skeletal system is kind of like working together with the muscular system to allow you to move. So if you just had muscles but you didn't have any bones, when those muscles contract, you would just be kind of like a pulsing mass on the floor. You wouldn't be able to really move anywhere effectively. You have to have the bones as something for the muscles to pull against. So those bones are kind of acting as a lever for the muscles to pull against, so you can actually move body parts instead of pulsing. Another major function of the skeletal system is to produce the different cell types that you have in your blood. So you have a bunch of stem cells inside of your bones in the bone marrow. Those are stem cells that are making actually a bunch of different cell types, but prominently, like all the cells in your blood are produced in that bone marrow, which is why we call it a stem cell garden. And finally, since the bones have a lot of calcium in them, you're actually using them as a place to store calcium. So if you kind of need a little more calcium and you're not getting it in your diet, you're going to take it out of your bones. So then you have the muscular system, which actually there's 3 different types of muscle in your body. First, you have the skeletal muscle, which is the type that you're kind of most used to thinking about. That's the type that's actually attached to your bones and allows you to move by working in conjunction with the skeletal system. But you also have cardiac muscle, which is just your heart, so that's part of the muscular system, but also part of the cardiovascular system. And you have smooth muscle, which is embedded in different organs in the body, and so that's part of the muscular system, but that's also part of whatever organ system the organs that it's in are a part of. So the skeletal muscle is functioning, of course, in movement, but also to produce heat, because whenever muscle contracts, that produces heat. So when you shiver, that's just contracting your skeletal muscles to bring up your body heat. And then the other types of muscle, the smooth and cardiac muscle, are kind of working together to control how things are moving through the body. So the cardiac muscle, of course, is helping to control the movement of blood through your cardiovascular system. And smooth muscle is controlling, usually you would find it, either lining a hollow organ that a fluid is passing through, so it would be controlling the movement of fluid through that organ, or you would find it, making a sphincter to control passage of a fluid through an orifice. So that includes actually in your cardiovascular system, your blood vessels have smooth muscle in their walls that controls your blood pressure and how the blood is moving through your blood vessels. In the digestive system, all those organs have smooth muscle in their walls to control how food is moving through the digestive system. Also, there's different sphincters at different points in the digestive system. So, for instance, to allow food to enter the stomach, to allow food to exit the stomach, and then to allow, feces to exit the body. So controlling movement of substances through the body would be kind of the main function of smooth and cardiac muscle. Then you have the nervous system, which is including the brain, the spinal cord, and all of the nerves in your body that are connecting the different parts of your body to the brain and spinal cord. The nervous system is important for controlling most of your bodily functions. So most organs in your body are going to be contacted by nerves in some way or another, and their function will be controlled or regulated by those nerves and by the brain and spinal cord. In addition to controlling those bodily functions, the nervous system is important for coordinating them so that they're kind of working together to make sure that different parts of your body or different organs are kind of working together in concert to carry out the functions of your body at the appropriate time and to kind of shut those functions down if it's an inappropriate time. The nervous system allows you to kind of perceive your environment and respond to that environment. So responsiveness is a characteristic of living things, and that you need the nervous system for that, the ability to respond to things in your environment. Also, all that stuff that you kind of think of as being you, like your likes, your dislikes, your personality, your emotions, your thoughts, that's all created by the brain. So the brain is like the seat of consciousness, and so the nervous system is really important for you as a person. Then you have the endocrine system, which is basically all the different glands in your body that release hormones. Endocrine just means actually secretion on the inside, but actually the way that we use it, endocrine means specifically secreting a hormone, and a hormone is a signaling molecule that travels in the blood. So the endocrine system kind of works together with the nervous system to coordinate the different functions of the body. So you have nerves telling different organs what to do, but you'll also have hormones telling different organs what to do and when to do it. One kind of function of the body that the endocrine system controls more than the nervous system does is just basic growth and development. So your hormones are the main kind of the main things that's responsible for you growing and maturing from a child into an adult, and also responsible for coordinating your sexual and reproductive functions so you can make, more of you. Although actually the endocrine system is extensively controlled by the nervous system. So the nervous system has its hand in that as well. Then you have the cardiovascular system, which is the heart and all of the blood vessels in your body. So its function is to move blood around the body. Actually, blood is also part of the cardiovascular system, as you might guess. That blood is carrying oxygen to all of the different cells in your body. It also carries nutrients that you had absorbed through the digestive system, like from your food. Also, hormones travel in the blood to reach different parts of the body. Immune cells are in the blood, so they can kind of go all over the body wherever they're needed. Waste products that your cells produce will enter the blood and be carried to a place where they can be excreted. So the cardiovascular system is transporting things around the body, both nutrients and signaling molecules and wastes, all different types of things. Then you have the lymphatic system, which has kind of a couple of different roles. One of its major roles is to kind of pick up fluid that kind of leaked out of your blood and return it to the blood so that you don't have fluid getting trapped in the different tissues of your body, and it returns that fluid to the blood. But the other major role of the lymphatic system is just a bunch of different immune systems or immune functions. So the lymphatic system will kind of be carrying invaders like pathogens to the immune cells, and it also stores those immune cells. So if you have maybe you have like a cut and bacteria get inside the cut, those bacteria may end up entering the lymphatic system, where they're going to be carried to maybe a lymph node that has a bunch of different immune cells that will respond to those bacteria and fight off the infection. And I guess I'll mention that it's specifically the adaptive immune system that is really closely associated with the lymphatic system. So the adaptive immune system would be kind of the branch of the immune system that is identifying specific pathogens and responding to them. It would also be the branch that's producing antibodies. Then you have the respiratory system, which is kind of your lungs, and then the respiratory tract, kind of the path that air takes to get into your body, into the lungs. Its major function is to get oxygen from the air and bring it into your body and drop it off into the blood, and then also to take CO2 or carbon dioxide from the blood and excrete that out of the body as a waste product. CO2 is actually an acid, so whenever you're removing CO2 from the blood and excreting it using the respiratory system, you're also altering the pH of the blood. So in addition to controlling carbon dioxide excretion, the respiratory system is kind of helping to control the pH of the body. Then you have the digestive system. So the digestive system is basically the gastrointestinal tract, which is extending from your mouth to your anus, including the oral cavity, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. And it's also including the different glands that secrete things into the gastrointestinal tract. So that includes your liver, your gallbladder, and your pancreas. Also your salivary glands in the mouth. The basic function of the digestive system is to take in food from the environment, break it down, get the nutrients out of it, absorb them into your blood, and then get rid of whatever was left that you weren't able to use by excreting it. So it's the basic source of nutrients other than oxygen in your blood. But in addition to that, it has a large role to play in maintaining the balance of your fluids and your ions, because I guess you're going to actually end up excreting a lot of fluids and ions into your intestines to help you digest your food, and then you can kind of control how much of that you reclaim in the large intestine. So if you have diarrhea, that means that you secreted a lot of water, but you didn't reclaim very much of it. If you have hard feces, then you reclaimed a lot of water. So depending on how much of that water you reclaim, That's going to alter how much water you have in your body. So the digestive system has a role to play in maintaining the balance of your fluids, also your ions dissolved in that water, and since some of those ions are hydrogen ions, also the pH. Then you have the urinary system, which is including your kidneys and your bladder, and then the little tubes that connect all that together. The major function of the urinary system is to filter waste products out of your blood and then excrete them as urine. And it also has a major role to play in helping, along with the digestive system, in helping you balance your fluids, your ions, and your pH. That's because whenever you're filtering waste out of the blood, you're going to end up filtering a lot of water out and a lot of ions out. Some of those ions are acids or bases. And then the kind of second part of the kidneys is going to be reclaiming a lot of that stuff. So putting most of that water back into the blood, most of the ions back into the blood, but leaving, of course, the waste products behind to go into the urine. So depending on how much water and ions you're reclaiming, that's going to affect how much you have in your body. Then finally, you have the reproductive system, which is the only organ system that is significantly different between men and women. The main function of the reproductive system, of course, is to make children, make more of you. And it's also responsible for the other differences between men and women that we can kind of assess like visually, which would be called these secondary sexual characteristics. So that's like the fact that men are taller and usually will have like bigger muscles. Women will have like a different fat distribution, will have like bigger hips, and less body hair. So those are all secondary sexual characteristics. Those are created by hormones that are produced by the reproductive system. So in men, the reproductive system is the male genitalia. In women, it's the female genitalia and also the mammary glands in the breasts. So men actually have mammary glands as well, but they're not functional, so we don't really count them. Alrighty, so now we've got our introductory kind of stuff done, and we'll get into that language of anatomy. So first, we've got several different ways that anatomy could be categorized and different terms for those categories. So first, you can have systemic anatomy, which is the anatomy of different organ systems. You can also have regional anatomy, that's the anatomy of different parts of the body, including whatever organ systems are within them. You also have surface anatomy, which is the anatomy of the surface of the body. You have gross anatomy, which is kind of the anatomy of structures that can be seen with the eye. Then you have microscopic anatomy, which is the structure of things that can only be seen with a microscope. And within microscopic anatomy, you have two different branches. One is histology, which is the study of tissues, and the other is cytology, which is the study of cells, the structure of tissues, the structure of cells. So our next chapter is actually on histology, and we'll talk more about the types of tissues and a little bit about how they're studied. For physiology, we would always be categorizing it either by organ system or by organ. So we'd be looking at the function of an organ system or of a specific organ. When we are talking about structures in anatomy and kind of where they are in the body, we always assume that we're talking about a person who is in the anatomical position, which is a person standing upright with their arms down at their sides and their palms turned out to face towards the front. And with their feet shoulder width apart and kind of with their heads just looking straight ahead, so their neck's in like a neutral position. So even if a patient's body is in a different position, even if they're lying down or something, we always talk about structures in their body or injuries or anything like that as though they were in the anatomical position. The reason for that is just to cut down on confusion and make sure that we're always identifying structures correctly. Otherwise, it's possible that we might get confused, and in the worst case scenario, you might actually have maybe a surgical procedure end up being done on the wrong part of the body, which would be pretty bad. And actually, that does happen sometimes. So to prevent those things from happening, it's important to always be really clear in our terminology about what we're talking about, including assuming that the patient is always in the anatomical position or talking about them as though they were. A couple of other positions that are related to a person laying down would be supine and prone. So a person who's in a supine position is laying on their back, and a person who's in a prone position is laying on their stomach. We also use specific directional terms in anatomy to describe where one thing is compared to another thing. The general terms that we use that apply to all parts of the body are anterior versus posterior, which means front versus back, medial versus lateral, which means towards the middle of the body or the midline of the body versus away from that midline, superficial versus deep, close to the surface versus like deeper underneath the surface, and then right and left, of course. When we're talking about right and left, we're always talking about the patient's right and left, not your right and left. That way, again, we just avoid any confusion. So no matter which way you're facing, right and left is always referring to the patient's right or the patient's left. So on these figures, it kind of shows the directional terms. So first we have anterior, that's something that's towards the front or the front of the body. Then we have posterior, which would be something that's towards the back of the body or behind something else. Medial means towards the midline of the body. Sometimes it can refer to the midline of a specific structure. Otherwise, you would just assume it's the midline of the body. Lateral means more out towards the side or further away from the midline. Superficial means close to the surface of the body. Deep means further, down within the body, in the internal part of the body. And then, of course, right and left. So let's see. This would be the patient's left. This is the patient's right. Even though the way we're looking at it, this is left and this is right, but we're always talking about the patient's left and the patient's right. So here's left for the patient and here's right for the patient. There's also a couple more sets of terms that do not apply to the whole body, but only to part of the body. So for the trunk, we have superior and inferior. For the limbs, we have proximal and distal. So kind of for the torso and the head, that's where you would use the term superior or inferior. Superior means something that's on top. Inferior means on the bottom or, kind of further down towards the ground. For the limbs, which would be the arms and the legs, we use the terms proximal and distal instead of superior and inferior. Proximal means closer to where the limb emerges from the body, which would be either closer to the shoulder or closer to the hip. Distal means further away from that point, so either closer to the fingers or closer to the toes. So for the trunk of the body, you have superior being closer kind of to the head or to the top, and inferior being, closer to the bottom or to the butt. Then for the limbs, you have proximal and distal. Proximal is closer to the shoulders or closer to the hips. Distal is closer to the fingers or closer to the toes. So proximal closer to the origin point for that limb, distal further away from the origin point of that limb. The reason why we use those two separate terms or sets of terms is because you can kind of move, your arms and your legs. So if you were referring to, let's say, a cut that you have on your forearm, that would be superior to your wrist. But if you were to raise your arm over your head, now it would be below your wrist, so now it would be inferior to your wrist. And that could get confusing, so we want to make sure that we're always using terms that are used the same way every time, so we prevent confusion. So that's why we use proximal and distal for the limbs. No matter where your arm is, always a cut that's on your forearm is going to be proximal to your wrist, no matter what position that limb is in. So there's also another set of directional terms in anatomy that we're not going to use them in here, but you might come across them somewhere. They would be ventral, dorsal, caudal, and cranial or cephalad. So you don't need to know these for this class, but I did want to make you aware of them in case you happen across them later on. So ventral just means towards the belly, whereas dorsal means towards the back, as in literally your spine, your back. So posterior means kind of back in direction, like behind. Dorsal means literally towards a person's back structure. And then you have caudal, which is towards the tail, and cranial, also called cephalad, which is towards the head. So the major difference between that set of terms and the other one that we just went over is that the first set, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, those are referring to kind of directions in space, like front, backwards, up, down. Ventral, dorsal, caudal, and cranial or cephalad are referring to body parts, not directions in space. So this figure can kind of help you see kind of the comparison between the two sets of directional terms. And they are kind of different depending on what type of creature we're talking about. So for a human, anterior and ventral correspond to each other because the belly is in the front, and posterior and dorsal correspond to each other because the back is in the back. Superior and cranial or cephalad correspond to each other because the head's on top. And inferior or caudal correspond to each other because the tail is on the bottom. Of course, actually your legs are below your kind of tailbone, but the tail is the bottom of the spinal column. But for a dog that walks on four legs, its back is oriented in a different way. So for the dog, its head is actually anterior towards the front. So anterior corresponds to cranial for a dog or for any other four-legged animal. The tail of the dog is to the back, so posterior corresponds to caudal for a dog. The back of the dog is on top, so superior is dorsal for a dog, and the belly of the dog is on the bottom, so inferior corresponds to ventral for a dog. And again, you don't need to know those terms for a test or anything like that, but I just wanted to go over them in case you encounter them. So now that we've covered the directional terms, we'll cover the planes of section, or the major planes of section. So a plane of section is basically what plane you are cutting the body in, or what plane you're cutting a sample in if you're going to cut it up so that you can look at it under a microscope. Of course, if you're going to look at any type of tissue or body part under a microscope, you have to make it really thin so the light can pass through it, so you have to slice it. And rather than just slicing it any old way, any which way, you're going to choose a specific plane of section that you're going to slice it in. And there's three major planes of section that you might choose. The first is the sagittal plane, which is kind of just going up and down, or from superior to inferior. So dividing the body into a left part and a right part. If you are using a mid-sagittal plane, then you're actually cutting exactly along the midline of the body. So you would get two equal halves out of that type of cut. Then a parasagittal cut is to the side of the midline, either to the right or to the left of the midline, so that you would get two halves that are not equal. Either the right or the left would be larger. Both of those are types of sagittal cuts along the sagittal plane. And another word for the sagittal plane is the median plane. Then you have the frontal plane, which would be kind of dividing the body into a front part and a back part, or an anterior half and a posterior half. That's also called a coronal section. And then finally you have the transverse section, or the transverse plane, which is basically a cut going across the body, perpendicular to the body, so dividing it into a top part and a bottom part, or superior and inferior parts. If you made that cut through a limb, though, you would be dividing it into a proximal part and a distal part, not a superior or an inferior part. And another name for the transverse plane is the horizontal plane, because, it is oriented horizontally. Then we have the anatomical body regions. So the body is divided into 43 different regions. Each one has its own unique name. And these regions are used in surgery, or in medicine in general, to describe the location of an injury maybe, or to describe where an incision needs to be made. So you would actually use these body regions in conjunction with the anatomical directional terms to describe kind of exactly where an injury is located, or where a cut needs to be made. So you do not need to remember these terms for this class. I just wanted to, bring them to your awareness because there's kind of a lot of them. So they're just used to help us be really accurate about kind of how we're communicating about where things are located on the body. And here are the rest of them. So now that we've covered those kind of terms, we'll go through the body cavities. There's two major cavities in the body. You have the posterior cavity in the back and the anterior cavity in the front. Then both of those cavities have more subdivisions that we will go through. For the posterior cavity, that is basically the cavity or the space that is enclosed by the skull or the bones of the skull and then by the vertebral column, and it contains the nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord. It's kind of smaller, so you might not really think about it as being a cavity, but it is a cavity that happens to be filled with an organ, which were two organs, the brain and the spinal cord. Then you have the anterior cavity, which is the one that you're used to thinking about probably as being like your body cavity. So the superior part of that cavity is bounded by the ribs. Then posteriorly it's bounded by the vertebrae, and kind of the inferior part of it is just bounded by muscles, by your abdominal muscles. Most of your internal organs are housed somewhere within that anterior body cavity, and it has a number of different subdivisions that house different organs. So first for the posterior body cavity, that is divided into the cranial cavity, which is superior, and then the vertebral cavity or the spinal cavity, which is inferior. So the cranial cavity, of course, is formed by the skull and it has the brain. The vertebral cavity, also called the spinal cavity, is formed by the vertebral column, of course, and it has the spinal cord. The anterior body cavity has much more complex subdivisions, and some of its subdivisions even have subdivisions of their own. So first, you have two major subdivisions, which would be the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So on top or superiorly, you have the thoracic cavity, then beneath it or inferior to it, you have the abdominal pelvic cavity. And in between them, you have the diaphragm muscle separating them. For the thoracic cavity, that is further subdivided into three more cavities. So you have the left pleural cavity and the right pleural cavity that each contain the lungs, or one of the lungs, and then in the middle between them, or medial to them, you have the mediastinum. Then actually within the mediastinum, you have another cavity, which is the pericardial cavity. That has the heart. So within the mediastinum, you have actually a number of different structures kind of passing through it. First, you have the esophagus passing through. There's also the trachea. There's the major blood vessels that come out of your heart, which we call the great vessels. And then, of course, the heart itself, which is actually tucked into the pericardial cavity within the mediastinum. Then for the abdominal pelvic cavity, the subdivisions are a little bit simpler for that one. It's just divided into the abdominal cavity superiorly and then the pelvic cavity inferiorly. So the abdominal cavity has most of your digestive organs, it has a number of lymphatic organs, and also has your kidneys. And it also contains another cavity within it called the peritoneal cavity, which is really kind of large and not very well defined. It's basically formed by a membrane inside the abdominal pelvic cavity, which we'll go into that in a moment actually. So some of those organs within the abdominal cavity are actually contained within the peritoneal cavity. Then for the pelvic cavity, that contains basically part of the large intestine, contains the reproductive organs, and it contains the bladder. So on this diagram, it's showing kind of the subdivisions of the anterior body cavity. So first you have the thoracic cavity versus the abdominal pelvic cavity. Then the thoracic cavity is further subdivided into the, this would be the left pleural cavity because it's the patient's left. This is the right pleural cavity. And then the mediastinum is this darker blue thing, but it also includes the green bit. Then this green bit is the pericardial cavity that is actually located inside of the mediastinum. Then for the abdominal pelvic cavity, that's just divided into the abdominal cavity on top and the pelvic cavity on bottom. And it isn't shown in this diagram, but the peritoneal cavity would actually be here inside of the abdominal cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity is really large, and it houses a lot of different organs that things could go wrong with. And whenever you have an issue with one of those organs, you probably might end up with like abdominal pain, which can be used as like a way to diagnose kind of what's going on with you. But the issue is that, you know, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what organ is causing that pain when there's so many organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So to help solve that kind of problem, we've divided the abdominal pelvic cavity into different regions. And then if you can localize like where the pain is to a specific region, then you can kind of look at what organs are in that region and hopefully get an idea of what organ might be having a problem. So you don't need to remember these region names for the test actually, I just wanted to make you aware of them. In one scheme, you're just dividing the abdominal pelvic cavity into 4 quadrants. So the right upper one, the left upper one, the left lower one, and the right lower one. In the other scheme, you're dividing it into 9 different squares that each has its own name. So I won't really read off the name of all of these, but you know, there's nine different ones. So some of those body cavity subdivisions that we had mentioned are actually formed by membranes called serous membranes. That would include the left and right pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity and the peritoneal cavity. So a serous membrane is kind of a special type of membrane. It's actually folded in on itself, sort of like a beanbag, so that it's kind of like well, I guess this diagram kind of illustrates it, where it's like kind of like a bag, and then you kind of would wrap it around an organ that it's going to go, that, you know, it will end up surrounding until it is, you know, surrounding that organ. So because this is a bag that you've wrapped around something, that means that you've got 2 layers here of that serous membrane. And if you zoom in here, you can see here is the innermost layer, which would also be the deep layer, the deepmost layer. And then in kind of lighter purple or lilac, you have the outermost layer, which is the superficial layer. Then well, I guess each layer has its own kind of special name. So the deep layer is the visceral layer. That's going to be the layer that is actually directly touching whatever organ the serous membrane is enclosing. And then the superficial layer is called the parietal layer. In between them, you have a space, which is filled with fluid. And that fluid is basically acting as lubricant to reduce friction. Oh, and I guess I go over that here, haha. So yeah, your innermost layer, which is the deep layer, is called visceral. The outermost layer, which is a superficial layer, is always called the parietal layer. And in between them, you have your serous fluid, which just functions as a lubricant, basically. So some of these organs are kind of, you know, moving as they do their jobs. In particular, the heart has to, of course, you know, contract with every time that it pumps blood out. And if you had no serous membrane there, then the heart would just be kind of rubbing against the other structures in the chest as it's pumping and contracting. And that would cause wear and tear on the heart, which would damage it. So in order to prevent that from happening, you have the serous membrane enclosing that heart, and you have serous fluid in between the 2 layers of the serous membrane. So when the heart beats, it's actually just the visceral layer of that serous membrane that is going to move with it. The parietal layer will stay in place against the other structures of the chest. That way you don't get anything rubbing against anything else. If anything, you would have the visceral and parietal layers of the serous membrane rubbing together, but they don't actually rub together because the serous fluid is separating them, and it's, you know, has very little friction, so, you know, it lubricates them, you know, so they can move without friction. Same thing with the lungs. As your lungs are expanding and contracting as you breathe, it would be bad for you if you didn't have any serous membrane there. That would mean the lung is just kind of rubbing against the other structures in the chest, which would damage it. So with the serous membrane there, actually the visceral layer will just stay right next to the lungs. The parietal layer will stay right next to the other chest structures, and the serous fluid in between them will prevent them from rubbing against each other. So the different serous membranes each have like their own name. So first you have the pleural membranes, which house the lungs and form the pleural cavities within the thoracic cavity. Those are divided into their two layers. The visceral pleura is the layer of those membranes that is right up against the lungs, and the parietal pleura is the layer of those membranes that is superficial to the visceral layer, so it's kind of outer, it's the outermost layer. Then you also have the pericardial membrane, which is the one that goes around the heart and forms the pericardial cavity. That also is divided the same way into the visceral pericardium, which is the layer that's right up against the heart, and then the parietal pericardium, which is the layer that is superficial or outermost. So you can actually see that in this section. This would be a transverse or horizontal section through the thoracic cavity, and it's showing the two pleural cavities with the lungs inside of them, and the serous membrane is actually this blue line here. And then you have the pericardial cavity that has the heart in it, and again the blue line, which is the pericardial membrane. Right, so the blue lines that are around the lungs would be the pleural membranes, the right and left pleural membranes. The blue line that's around the heart is the pericardial membrane. Then if you look really close, you can actually see like there's kind of a darker blue line that's right up against the lungs or right up against the heart. So that's the visceral layer. So the visceral pleura in this case if it's the lungs, or the visceral pericardium if it's the heart. And then you can kind of see the little like lilac line also that is against the other structures of the chest, so the chest wall structures basically. That is the the parietal pleura if we're talking about the pleural membrane, or the parietal pericardium if we're talking about the pericardial membrane. Then you have the peritoneal membrane, which is really large. It's by far the biggest serous membrane in the body. It's located in the abdominal cavity, and it forms the peritoneal cavity. You divide it into the parietal peritoneum, which is right up against an organ within the abdominal cavity. Sorry, actually, I misspoke. The visceral peritoneum is right up against an organ in the abdominal cavity. The parietal peritoneum is outer from that. So it would be superficial to that visceral peritoneum. The peritoneal membrane is actually really complicated in its structure. It's kind of really folded up in the abdominal cavity, kind of folded around all those different organs in there. So you can see like from the front it looks pretty simple. It's this kind of grayed out area, but if you look at it from the side, then it gets real complicated. It has all these different folds, kind of like fingers that it's sending out that kind of enclose the different parts of the intestine and the other major organs in the abdominal cavity. So actually each one of these little extensions or folds of the peritoneal membrane has its own name. So the naming gets really complicated. We are not going to worry about those names. That's okay. We'll just say peritoneal membrane is the name of the whole thing. Most of the organs in your abdominal cavity are kind of housed within the folds of that peritoneal membrane. So that would include your liver, the stomach, and most of your small and large intestines, also the spleen. So all of those organs are called intraperitoneal organs because they are inside the peritoneal membrane. Intra just means in or inside. You also have a few organs that are not enclosed by the peritoneal membrane, but instead they're kind of sitting behind it or posterior to it. Those are called the retroperitoneal organs, and they would include the kidneys, most of the pancreas, and some of the intestines, especially some of the large intestine. Retro just means behind, so retroperitoneal is the organs behind the peritoneal membrane. Actually, you don't need to know like which organ is which there. So now that we've covered the language of anatomy, I just want to go over a few concepts in physiology that kind of apply to all the different organ systems that we're going to study in A&P 1 and that you'll study in A&P 2. So first, I would like to introduce to you the idea of a Rube Goldberg machine, which some of you might have heard of. Probably you all have seen them before, but you might not have known like what to call them. So a Rube Goldberg machine can be defined as a machine that's intentionally designed to perform a simple task in an indirect and overly complicated manner, frequently involving a domino effect. It's called the Rube Goldberg machine, or a Rube Goldberg machine, because this cartoonist called Rube Goldberg used to draw like machines like this in his cartoons. And the image there is an example of one of his cartoons featuring a Rube Goldberg machine. So this machine is designed to operate a napkin whenever this man brings a spoonful of soup to his mouth. So as he brings a spoonful of soup to his mouth, the napkin is supposed to come and wipe like his mustache without him having to do that. But as you can see, it's a very complicated machine involving lots of different contraptions, including a bird, and I don't even know what this is, and some clocks, and it's just a lot. So, it would be much, much simpler if he would just wipe his face with the napkin. But, I guess that's not the point of the Rube Goldberg machine. The Rube Goldberg machine is, supposed to do it in as complicated a manner as possible. So I'm bringing up the Rube Goldberg machine because as you learn about mechanisms in biology or in physiology for how things are actually accomplished in the body, or how body parts actually function, it really is like there's just Rube Goldberg machines everywhere in there. Everything is just way more complicated than it needs to be, and there's domino effects all over the place, where one thing causes another thing to happen, and then that causes a third thing to happen, and then that causes a fourth thing to happen, so on and so forth, until eventually you get something done. So next I want to show you a commercial for Honda, for the Honda Accord, called the Cog. Which is, I guess, kind of a famous commercial from 2003. And it's famous because they were the engineers at Honda built a Rube Goldberg machine for the commercial using only the parts from a Honda Accord. It's a really big, complicated machine, and it's pretty cool. And I wanted to show it to you because it's an example of kind of a real-life Rube Goldberg machine, and it surprisingly kind of mirrors some of the processes that occur in the body, just because it is a Rube Goldberg machine. So in this commercial, there's only 2 shots that they took. So they basically are showing you the whole machine functioning, but into, I guess, kind of 2 different halves. And the reason for that is just because it was too big to fit in their warehouse, so they kind of had to build it like, they had to build it in 2 different halves, and then take 2 different shots of each half. So the only computer graphics in the commercial are just right where that cut is between the 2 shots to smooth it out. Otherwise, it's just the camera recording the Rube Goldberg machine in action. And it took them a lot of different tries to get the machine to work right. I guess just because it's so complicated, it was really hard to make it work correctly. So on the next slide, we'll have the cog.
Isn't it nice when things just work?
So as I mentioned, that commercial, had to be reshot many times to get a take where the whole machine worked correctly, or the whole half of the machine worked correctly. Um, and actually, it took them 60 tries to get it right. So 59 times that they tried to make this machine work, it failed to work. Like one part or another would fail to work properly. And it was just tiny fluctuations in the conditions in the room that caused that to happen. Little fluctuations in the humidity or temperature of the room, or dust being in one place or another place, would cause some part of that domino effect that the machine is relying on to fail to work right. So in the body, we have a lot of Rube Goldberg machines, and they're all really complicated, kind of like the machine built for this commercial. The main difference between this machine and the ones occurring in your body that, operate your basic biological processes is just that, of course, Honda Accord is an inorganic object, and you are an organism, but apart from that, it's just the fact that your Rube Goldberg machines don't work one time out of 60 times. It's much more likely that they work 60 times out of 60 times, or 59 times out of 60 times, right? They're working properly almost every single time that they run, not just, occasionally. And not just that, but you have a lot of different Rube Goldberg machines inside of your body, inside of every cell, that are all kind of interlocking with each other, and sharing parts with each other. So, I mean, you could imagine if they had made multiple of those machines, one for the Honda Accord and others for like other models of car that the Honda sells, and they all kind of overlapped with each other, you can imagine how many takes they would have needed to get a shot right on that. In your body, like, you have a lot of overlapping Rube Goldberg machines, and they all work right virtually every single time that they run. And it's really, it's pretty impressive, you guys. Your body does a good job. So here's an example of a Rube Goldberg machine in the body, and you don't need to know like any of the details here, but I just wanted to show it to you as an example. So this is a diagram showing the different receptor types for serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter in the brain. So serotonin carries messages in the brain, from one neuron to the next neuron. And when it's going to arrive at the neuron that's receiving the message, it has to have a receptor that it binds to, that will kind of transmit the message into the cell and make something happen in the cell in response to that message. So you have a bunch of different receptor subtypes for serotonin. It's not just one receptor, there's a bunch of types, and each one will kick off a slightly different chain of events inside the cell. So there's a little bit different Rube Goldberg machine for each of these receptors. So let me kind of go through this a bit with you guys. At the top here we have serotonin. These other things are molecules that you can use in the lab to activate specific serotonin receptors, but not all of them. And then serotonin itself, of course, will activate all of them. So all of these guys that are embedded in this membrane are serotonin receptors. So serotonin binds to one of these receptors. That is going to kick off a chain of events where first you're activating this G protein here. For some of them, like these three would be activating this G protein, and then once the G protein is activated, it's going to come and turn on this AC enzyme here. That's adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase, when it's activated, will take ATP and convert it into CAMP, or cyclic AMP. Then cyclic AMP will activate this enzyme, PKA, which is protein kinase A, which will then activate this whole series of enzymes, first RAF, then MEK, then MAPK, then ERK1 or ERK2. And a couple of these are actually transcription factors, which means that they're not just enzymes, but they're actually going to travel into the nucleus of the cell and activate more proteins inside the cell, or inside the cell nucleus, ultimately activating Krebs, which will bind to specific sequences within the DNA in the nucleus and cause specific proteins to be manufactured, or specific genes to turn on and manufacture certain proteins. For instance, this protein BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. On the other hand, if you have these serotonin receptors activated, that's going to activate this G protein, which will inhibit adenylyl cyclase instead of activating it. So that would turn this whole cascade off. But so as you can see, this is really complicated. You don't just have like serotonin bind a receptor and then one protein goes into the nucleus and turns on gene expression. Actually, it's a bunch of different proteins that each play their own role in this giant Rube Goldberg machine, which is like, you know, just dominoes falling over and hitting each other to activate the next domino to fall, until eventually you start making proteins like BDNF. BDNF actually, we're not fully, you know, sure of all the functions that it has, but it has been implicated in depression. So for people who have depression, it's been noticed that they don't have as much BDNF in their brains as a healthy person has. We know that a lot of antidepressant drugs target serotonin and increase serotonin signaling in the brain. We don't really know why those drugs, you know, help with depression, but we do know that they increase serotonin signaling in the brain. And so one kind of hypothesis for how increasing serotonin could maybe help depression would be that when you increase serotonin, depending on what receptor subtypes you're activating, you are going to increase the production of BDNF, which is associated with not having depression. So again, you don't need to like remember any of the details there. Mostly, I just wanted you to realize that this is a really complicated cascade of events that is occurring, you know, in the brain every time serotonin signals to a neuron. And it's not just for serotonin, it's for any other signaling molecule basically in the body, any other process in the body really that's occurring on the level of individual cells is going to have a cascade like this, a Rube Goldberg machine just like this. Not one that works, you know, one time out of every 60 times that it tries to run, but one that works basically every single time. So just to kind of summarize this again, I've kind of got a breakdown of how the body is like a Rube Goldberg machine in terms of its functioning and how it's not like it. The Rube Goldberg machine uses indirect and overcomplicated mechanisms to achieve its goal, or whatever its function is. The body does just the same thing. All of the mechanisms in the body are way more complicated than they need to be, or at least way more complicated than it would seem like they need to be. So if you were an engineer and you had to design, you know, some machine that was going to function in any way like how the body functions, you wouldn't make it that complicated. If you did, you would probably be fired. It's like, you know, if you could accomplish it with like, you know, 2 parts, but you're just like, you know what, I'm gonna add like 20 more parts to this and make it work again. It's way more complicated than it needs to be. Also, the Rube Goldberg machine involves domino effects to get things done. So one thing kind of activates, that activates a second thing, that activates a third thing, that activates a fourth thing, on down the line. So that is all over the place in the body. Everything that's getting done is basically getting done using some type of domino effect like that. The ways that the body is not like a Rube Goldberg machine would be that, of course, a Rube Goldberg machine is intentionally designed and the body is not. It has kind of been shaped over millions and, you know, even billions of years of evolution, if you're considering, you know, evolution of cells as well. You know, that's just by kind of mindless processes of natural selection. It has nothing to do with intention or purpose, really. And then also, the Rube Goldberg machine is intended to accomplish a simple task, like, you know, I guess in the commercial, the task was to, like, you know, push the on button on a car, or like the unlock button on a car, and in the cartoon, the task of the Rube Goldberg machine was to like have a napkin wipe a mustache. So the body doesn't do simple tasks like that. It does really complicated tasks, like you know, digesting food that's really complicated, or you know, looking at the world and seeing what's there. That's really complicated. Or having thoughts. Those things are all really complicated. Filtering the blood to get toxins out of it. Very complicated. So here we have kind of some more physiological themes that we're going to see coming up over and over again in anatomy and physiology, both 1 and 2. First, you have homeostasis. So in homeostasis, the body is basically regulating its environmental conditions, its kind of internal environmental conditions, to make sure that they are staying stable and kind of compatible with life. Right, so you have a specific internal body temperature. You have a specific pH that your blood is at, and it can vary a little bit, and that's fine, but if it varies a lot, that's a real problem for you. So you have a lot of different mechanisms in your body that are designed to keep those variables within a specific range that's right around where they're supposed to be at. And they won't go outside of that range unless your homeostatic mechanisms are failing to work properly. We have a couple of types of feedback loops. So first you have negative feedback loops, and then you have positive feedback loops. In a negative feedback loop, the results kind of blocks the cause. So for instance, if you are like let's say you're going outside on a hot day in El Paso. So you go out into the sun and your body temperature starts to rise. So that's the cause, your body temperature rising. Then your body's going to respond to that by activating homeostatic mechanisms that will reduce your body temperature back down by, for instance, making you sweat. So sweating is going to kind of cancel out the rise in your body temperature by having you evaporate energy out to the world, and that reduces your body temperature. Same thing if you go, probably not in El Paso, but if you go to a different place where they have snow and you go outside in the snow, then you're going to get cold. And your body temperature will start dropping. And so the body's going to respond to that by making you start shivering. And then shivering creates heat, and that raises your body temperature back up. So always with a negative feedback loop, the first thing causes the second thing to happen, but then the second thing kind of inhibits or blocks or cancels out the first thing or reverses the first thing. If your body temperature goes up, the response will be for something to happen that makes it go back down. Those types of negative feedback loops are really essential for maintaining homeostasis. Without them, you're not going to be able, you're not going to be able to do homeostasis really, right? In order to have your body temperature stay within a specific range, if it goes above that range, you have to bring it back down. You can't have a response that makes it go higher. You have to have a response that makes it go back down. If your body temperature drops, you need a response to reverse that and make it go back up. So that requires negative feedback loops. Then you also have positive feedback loops that are kind of less common, but you do find them in some cases. So in a positive feedback loop, the cause causes the effect, and then that effect magnifies the cause. So that would be like if your body temperature rose and then you started shivering and your body temperature rises even higher. So those aren't usually used to maintain homeostasis quite as much, but they are used sometimes just to kind of make things happen more quickly. So for instance, if you have like a cut, that's going to mean that your blood pressure starts dropping as you're bleeding and losing blood out of the cut. Your blood pressure will drop. So you need your blood pressure also to be maintained within a specific range. So you need something that's going to bring that blood pressure back up. And one part of that is going to be a clot. So you need to form a clot so you can stop the bleeding and stop your blood pressure from dropping. Then you can have some other mechanism kick in to make sure that the blood pressure, stays regular or goes back to a regular level if it had dropped too low. So when you're forming that clot, you kind of need it to happen pretty quickly. As you're bleeding there, time is ticking, so the clot needs to form kind of as fast as possible. The first part of that clot forming, or one of the very first parts, is platelets in your blood activating and sticking together to make kind of a plug that blocks that damaged area in your blood vessel. So first you would have just maybe a couple of platelets become activated and stick to the injury that you have. And then once they're activated, they're going to start releasing chemicals that actually activate other platelets. So now other platelets are being activated. They come and they stick onto the first platelets on that injury, and they all start releasing their chemicals that activate other platelets. And next time you're going to get like a lot of platelets activated, and a lot of platelets are going to come stick to that injured area. And that process is just going to repeat until you get like a plug that is covering the entire injured or cut area that you have in your blood vessel. So that's a positive feedback loop that is making sure that platelets summon more platelets, which summon more platelets, which summon more platelets, until you have enough to plug the hole. And that way you get that done really quick. So sometimes you'll have positive feedback loops kind of within negative feedback loops, or just making certain things happen faster. Another major theme in A&P is form follows function. Actually, we always say it form follows function, but it really should be the other way around. Function follows form. Basically, the way that all of the structures in your body are shaped is determining how they function. So if you need the blood vessels that are coming right out of your heart, like the aorta, to carry a lot of blood, they're going to have to be big. The little blood vessels that are supplying blood to individual bits of your skin, they only need to carry a little bit of blood, so they can be small, or they should be small. And the same thing all over the body. Every structure has its shape because of what its function is, or I should say its shape serves its function. Its shape allows it to perform its function. Also, you have cell communication as a major theme. So cells will always be kind of talking to each other by sending chemical or electrical messages to each other. That way they can make sure that they're all kind of working together to get stuff done. They can make sure they're coordinating their different functions with each other. And yeah, they got to talk to each other. So hormones is an example of cells talking to each other. Neurotransmitters is an example of cells talking to each other. And there's other ones as well. And finally, gradients. So gradients are kind of the way that things happen spontaneously, right? So if you have, a hill, that's a gradient from, well, if you have like an object on top of that hill, like a round object, you have a gradient for that object where it has like high potential energy at the top of the hill and low potential energy at the bottom of the hill. And so it's going to follow that gradient down the hill. So this is how things kind of move spontaneously, like without you having to put in extra energy. So the body is going to be constantly making use of gradients wherever it can to get things done without having to spend extra energy on them. And we'll actually go into that more in a moment here. So first, for cell communication, your cells are all working together on all of the tasks that they have to do. Basically because, every cell is small, but the jobs that need to get done are kind of like body-sized jobs. One cell can only do a little bit. It can't do enough. If you have, cells in your intestines kind of trying to absorb nutrients from your food and put them in your bloodstream, one cell can only absorb so many nutrients, and it's not going to be enough to power your whole body. So you have to have all those cells working together to get enough nutrients absorbed to supply the entire body. So cells will always need to work together to accomplish kind of bigger scale tasks. And they can only work together if they're communicating with each other. So that is why they communicate. We can kind of categorize the different ways that cells communicate by the type of message that they're sending to each other, or by the distance that that message is covering once it's sent. So first, for message type, the message that cells are sending could either be chemical or electrical. Usually it's chemical, which would mean that one cell is releasing a chemical that travels to the other cell and delivers the message. There's a bunch of different types of chemical messengers. So you have hormones, you have neurotransmitters, you have cytokines, and that's only a small a small sampling. They're just literally everywhere. There's ridiculously many of them. Then you have electrical messages, which could be sent in certain cases where the cells are actually touching each other. So for any cells that are not physically touching each other, they have to communicate by a chemical message. Electrical messages will not work for them. So for communication types by distance, first we have autocrine communication, where a cell is communicating basically with itself. In that case, the cell is going to release a chemical messenger into the extracellular matrix, and then that messenger will just loop back around to the same cell that released it and bind a receptor on that cell and deliver its message. Then you have juxtacrine communication, which is for cells that are next to each other, right next to each other. In general, they have to be like physically touching each other actually. So for that, it could be an electrical message or it could be a chemical message also. It just kind of depends on the specific cell type. Then you have paracrine communication, which is one cell communicating with other cells that are nearby, kind of in its local area or within its local tissue. In that case, you have this cell releasing a chemical into the extracellular matrix that will kind of diffuse through the extracellular matrix until it reaches other cells that are nearby and binds receptors on those cells. Then you have endocrine communication, which is using hormones. In that type of communication, you have cells communicating with each other over really long distances. Possibly even it could be cells that are on the other side of the body from each other. So your cell that's sending the message is going to release its chemical messenger into the blood, and we call that messenger a hormone because it is traveling in the blood to carry a message. So that hormone is going to be moving in the blood all over the whole body. And when it finds the target cell that it's trying to deliver that message to, it will bind to its receptor on that cell and deliver the message. Then finally you have neuronal signaling, which is kind of a really special type of cell communication because it's occurring over a long distance, but it's not just, I guess you're not just releasing a chemical messenger that travels in the blood kind of everywhere all over the whole body. You're sending that message to one cell specifically using like the process of a neuron. So neurons send out their little processes, kind of the little tree-like things or threads that extend off of them, and those little threads will release chemicals. So you'll have an electrical signal actually traveling down that thread, and when it gets to the end of the thread, it makes it release a chemical, which is called a neurotransmitter, that crosses the little gap to the next cell that is going to receive that message. Only that next cell can get the message. Other cells that are nearby will not receive the message. So that's a special type of communication because you're not just targeting or you're not just sending the message to any cell who has a receptor, you're sending it to the specific cell that has the receptor and is nearby where that neurotransmitter is released. So here you have kind of a graphic summary of those types of communication. So first you have autocrine communication, a cell releasing a chemical that then just kind of turns around and binds to a receptor on that same cell that released it. Here you have juxtacrine communication, where these cells are touching. They're actually drawn with a little gap between them, but in real life they would be touching. So the one cell has a chemical that is kind of sticking out from its surface that will bind to a receptor on the other cell. It could also be an electrical signal that is sent across from the one cell to the other. Here you have paracrine communication, where your first cell is releasing a chemical that will just diffuse locally in the extracellular matrix until it reaches receptors on other cells nearby in the tissue. And then at the bottom you have endocrine communication, where your first cell is releasing a chemical called a hormone into the extracellular matrix. That hormone enters the blood. If it doesn't enter the blood, actually we don't call it a hormone. It's going to be carried in the blood all over the whole body, and wherever it finds cells that have a receptor for it, it's going to bind that receptor and deliver the message to all of those different cells, no matter where they're at in the body. And finally, we have our privileged communication, which is neuronal signaling. So here you have one of those little threads coming out of a neuron and attaching to a distant neuron. Actually, this one is kind of nearby, but some of these little threads are literally like the distance between the small of your back and your foot, so they can get really, really long. First, you have an electrical component where an electrical signal will actually travel down this little thread, which is actually called an axon, by the way. When it gets to the end, all these little places where that thread terminates or where that axon terminates, you have chemicals called neurotransmitters that can be released from there. So if we zoom in, we're going to see something kind of like this. Here is our little thread from the first neuron, or our axon from the first neuron terminating. The electrical signal comes down to the end of it, and when it gets there, it causes these little chemicals called neurotransmitters to be released, and they go across to a similar thread on the next cell, which is not called an axon actually, it's called a dendrite, because it receives messages instead of sending them. And you have little receptors there for the neurotransmitter, so the message is received by this neuron, but not by this neuron, or this neuron, or this neuron. Even if all of them have the right receptors, they're not getting the message. Only the one that's actually contacting the thread from the first neuron is getting the message. Okay, now for gradients. So first, we'll just go over what a gradient is in the first place. When you have a gradient, that means that you have a difference in how much of something there is in one area versus another area if those two areas are connected to each other. So there's a lot of gradients actually that we might come across in life, but one of the kind of easiest to see ones that's, that most people would have experience of is just making tea. So when you're making tea, you get your water and you heat that stuff up, and then you put your tea bag in the water. And then if you watch, you'll notice like little tea molecules leaving the tea bag and entering the water. You can actually see the water starting out clear and then getting kind of browner as the tea enters the water. And if you watch it closely, you'll notice that it's always browner right by the tea bag and less brown or more clear further away from the tea bag until, of course, your tea is done. So you have two areas there. You have the area that's right next to the tea bag. So in this image here, you have this area that's right next to the tea bag, and you have this area here that is farther away from the tea bag. And the two areas are connected to each other. So molecules can travel freely between one and the other. Most of the tea here is right by the tea bag, so you have a lot of tea there, and you have very little tea further away from the tea bag. You can tell because it's clear. So this means you have a gradient here, where you have a lot of tea by the bag and a little bit of tea away from the bag. That gives you a gradient. Because this is a gradient, more of something in one spot, less of that something in another spot, now you're going to have whatever that something is moving down its gradient. Everything will always move down its gradient, no matter what type of thing it is. In this case with tea, that's a concentration gradient. We have a high concentration of tea by the bag, a low concentration of tea farther from the bag, and tea molecules will move down their gradient from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration, in this case by diffusion. So if you just wait, that process is going to occur, and eventually you'll notice that you have the same amount of tea in all parts of the water, and now you have like tea that's ready to drink. So that is a spontaneous process, and you do not have to put extra energy in to make that happen. Technically it'll happen even if you don't heat the water. It's just that it's going to take like so long that it's not, you don't want to wait for days for your tea to be ready. So that's a concentration gradient, but we actually have a lot of other types of gradients also. There can be temperature gradients. So if you've ever used like a space heater, you probably might have noticed, or a fire also, if you've gone like camping and had a fire, you've probably noticed it's really, warm and nice and toasty right by the space heater or right by your fire. But if you kind of walk away from it, you get into like kind of that cold room zone. So the temperature is high right by the source of the heat, and it's lower further away from that. If you wait, the temperature is going to move, the heat is going to kind of expand and move from the area right by the heater to the rest of the room if this is a space heater, assuming that the room isn't just too huge for this little heater to even heat it up. You also have pressure gradients. That's how syringes operate. So with a syringe, you start out with kind of the syringe, the barrel full of liquid, and there's equal pressure inside the barrel and outside in the air. But then if you're going to operate the syringe, you would actually push down on the plunger, and that compresses the liquid inside the barrel, which whenever you're compressing something like that, you're going to raise its pressure. So that ends up with you having a high pressure inside the barrel and a lower pressure outside in the air. So that is a pressure gradient, and whatever this fluid is, it's going to move spontaneously from the area of high pressure to the area of low pressure. That is actually the reason why you're able to inject things using a syringe. That is how syringes work, based on creating that pressure gradient. And there's also organs in your body that exploit pressure gradients as well. For instance, your lungs and your kidneys. They operate based on a pressure gradient. You also have electrical gradients. So the example of an electrical gradient that we're probably all most familiar with is just a battery. In a battery, like what's shown here, you have kind of two halves of the battery. Of course, we all know there's a positive side and a negative side of the battery. If you were to actually look at what's inside of there, you actually have more positive charges on the positive side, and you have negative charges on the negative side of the battery. At this point, this is actually not a gradient because the two sides are completely separated from each other. There's no way for something to move from one side to the other side, so that's not a gradient yet. But if you were to plug this battery in, plug it into a circuit, like maybe put it in a flashlight, and then turn on the flashlight, now you have some connection between the two sides of the battery, so that is now a gradient. And charges are able to move from one side to the other down the gradient. In this case, you might figure that positive things would move down to negative things, but actually it's electricity, so it's weird, and it's the other way around. Actually, we have electrons moving from the negative end to the positive end. So they're kind of they're attracted to the positive end, they're going to move to the positive end. As they're moving, you're losing negative charges from the negative end. So electrons are negatively charged. So when an electron leaves this negative end, that is a negative charge leaving the negative end, and it's going to migrate to the positive end, making that positive end less positive. So as time passes and your battery is draining, what's actually happening is that charges from one end are moving to the other end, and that is leveling out your gradient. You are ending up having less and less and less of a difference between the charge on the two ends of the battery. When you don't have any difference at all, that's when the battery's dead. So in biology, we also have this kind of combo gradient, which is the electrochemical gradient. It's like a combination of an electrical gradient and a concentration gradient. And it's going to apply to ions, which are chemicals, so they're affected by concentration gradients. And they also have a charge, so they're affected by electrical gradients as well. So the electrochemical gradient is just kind of a combination of those two gradients that would affect different ions. These types of gradients and ions themselves are actually important for every single cell to maintain its basic homeostasis, but they're extra important for cells that are in the brain and in the muscles. So kind of the functions of the brain and the muscles, the neuronal signaling and muscle contraction, those things require ions to be moving along gradients. So electrochemical gradients and those ions are kind of extra important for those organs or systems. So here you have kind of an example or just kind of a diagram illustrating a basic electrochemical gradient, one for sodium and the other for potassium, so actually I had two. And I'll just kind of explain the diagram here. So first we have a left-hand side and we have a right-hand side. So we have two areas. Those areas are connected to each other by these little passages. And we have different amounts of potassium and sodium on each side. And we also have different amounts of charges on each side. So that means that we know we have gradients here. We're going to have concentration gradients and we're going to have electrical gradients too. So first let's look at potassium. You've got 4 potassiums over here on the left and 3 potassiums over here on the right. So that means that there's more potassium on the left, less on the right. So if you're looking at the concentration gradient for potassium, that points down to the right. Potassium should diffuse over to the right-hand side. If you're looking at the electrical gradient, that looks a little different. That's based on how many charges you have on each side here. And if you count them up, that's actually like 9 positive charges on the right-hand side and 4 positive charges on the left-hand side. So that is a difference in how many charges you have on each side, which means you have an electrical gradient. And since you have more positive charges on the right and less positive charges on the left, that means the right is more positive and the left is more negative. So the left is not actually like negatively charged, but it does have less positive charges than the right, so it is more negative than the right. Potassium has a positive charge on it, so it is going to be attracted to a negative charge. It's going to be repelled from positive charges. So that means that for potassium, it's going to be moving, according to its electrical gradient, towards the more negatively charged side and away from the more positively charged side. So for potassium, its concentration part of its electrochemical gradient is kind of pointing over to the right, but the electrical part of its electrochemical gradient is kind of pointing the other way to the left. So which way would potassium move? That's actually going to depend on the difference in the strengths between those two gradients. So it basically, is there a bigger difference in the concentration of potassium on both sides, or is there a bigger difference in the amount of charges present on both sides? In this case, it's actually a bigger difference in the amount of charges, 9 versus 4, compared to the amount of potassium, which is 4 versus 3. So potassium will probably end up moving overall to the left, but it's just going to move over there a little slower because its concentration gradient, or the concentration part of its electrochemical gradient, is actually pointing back the other way. For sodium, the situation is a lot more simple. You have a lot of sodium, 6 sodiums on the right, and you don't have any at all on the left. So you have a concentration gradient for sodium that is pointing to the left. Electrically, the electrical part of its electrochemical gradient is also pointing the same direction, because sodium also has a positive charge, so it would also like to move away from positive charges and towards negative charges, so it'll move towards the more negatively charged area. So both halves of sodium's electrochemical gradient are kind of pointing the same direction there. The concentration half is pointing it to the left, and the electrical half is also pointing it to the left. So it's definitely going to move to the left. The sodium, if you actually had ions moving across to either, from one side to the other, sodium would move across until it was basically kind of equal on both sides. And for potassium, that would move across until the force of its electrical gradient sending it one way kind of equals out to be the same as the force of its concentration gradient sending it the other way. So it's just kind of looking for the most equal situation that it can reach. So we're going to talk about these gradients again and ions moving down their gradients a lot more when we cover the nervous system, and then again later in the semester when we cover the muscular system. So these will be coming up again. But that was kind of the last major theme for physiology that we had to talk about.